somewhere inside a mountain in the Peruvian Andes, in a passage so narrow that two people cannot pass each other. The sound of a conch shell horn reverberates in a way that should not be physically possible. The tunnel twists, it branches, it doubles back on itself. And yet the sound, played at the entrance, arrives at the central chamber amplified, transformed, arriving from a direction that makes no immediate architectural sense. This was not an accident of construction. Acoustic tests conducted by researchers in recent decades have confirmed that the passageway system at Chavín de Huántar, built well over 2,000 years ago in the highlands of Peru, appears to have been deliberately engineered to manipulate sound. The people who carved those tunnels understood something about how sound moves through stone that took modern researchers' equipment and analysis to verify. That discovery is one of 5 in this documentary that forced archaeologists to revise not just their understanding of a single site, but their assumptions about the entire category of ancient capability. Each one arrived as a kind of quiet rupture, a moment when the evidence on the ground refused to match the framework being used to interpret it. In the jungles of Central America, in the highlands of East Africa, in the river valleys of the Balkans, and on a volcanic island in the Western Mediterranean, archaeology has uncovered things that were not expected, could not be easily explained, and have not, in some cases after decades of study, been fully resolved. The thread running through all of them is a question that keeps returning, undefeated. What does it mean to say a society was primitive when the physical record keeps demonstrating otherwise? High in the Andes of north-central Peru, at an elevation of over 3,000 meters, where 2 rivers converge, there is a ceremonial complex that served as one of the most influential religious centers in the ancient Americas, and whose internal architecture still generates genuine scholarly debate about the sophistication of its design. Chavín de Huántar was the ritual heart of the Chavín culture, which flourished from roughly 900 to 200 BCE. The site consists of a series of stone platform mounds, plazas, and, most remarkably, an interior network of stone-lined galleries and tunnels carved into and beneath the main temple structure. These passages, known as the galleries of the Lanzon, connect chambers at multiple levels, ventilate through a system of shafts that researchers have compared to functional air ducts, and converge on a central space housing a massive carved granite stela, the Lanzon itself, a 4.5-meter fanged deity figure wedged into a narrow cruciform chamber. The Chavín people did not leave a writing system. What we know of their ceremonial practice comes from the physical evidence at the site, from carved iconography, and from traces of botanical material recovered during excavations. That material, including remains of the San Pedro cactus, a plant containing mescaline, suggests that altered states of consciousness played a role in Chavín ritual, likely administered to participants before or during their passage through the underground galleries. The accepted interpretation is that the site functioned as an oracle center, drawing pilgrims from across a wide region of Andean South America who came to receive ritual guidance from a priestly class. The complexity of the underground galleries, dark, disorienting, acoustically strange, would have created powerful sensory conditions for individuals already in an altered state, reinforcing the authority of the ritual specialists who controlled access and movement through the space. What surprised researchers is the engineering precision involved. The gallery ventilation system, studied in detail in the 1970s by archaeologist Richard Berger and more recently by acoustic researchers including John Rick's team at Stanford, appears to function without gaps or obvious experimental error, meaning the builders understood what they were creating well enough to get it right the first time, or had refined it to a level of consistent effectiveness over time. The airflow through the shafts maintains a stable internal environment, despite the altitude and the mountain's mass above. The acoustic dimension adds another layer. Studies have found that certain gallery configurations at the site produce sound phenomena, including directional confusion and low-frequency resonance, that would heighten the disorientation of a ritual participant moving through the darkness. Whether this was a deliberate design feature or an emergent property of the architecture that practitioners learned to exploit is not yet settled. But the effect is real, and it is consistent. Chavín de Huántar is not unknown in archaeological literature, but the depth of its engineering, the convergence of ventilation, acoustics, spatial disorientation, and iconographic program into a single coherent ritual machine is still being fully appreciated. The mountain was not just a backdrop for the ceremony, it was the instrument. They sit in jungle clearings, in museum courtyards, in the gardens of government buildings in San Jose, and half buried in the sediment of the Diquís Delta in southern Costa Rica. Dozens of them, hundreds if the full original count is reconstructed. Stone spheres, carved from granodiorite and gabbro, ranging from a few centimeters in diameter to over 2.5 meters, the largest weighing an estimated 16 tons. The spheres were first brought to widespread attention in the 1930s when the United Fruit Company began clearing jungle in the Diquís Delta for banana plantations. Workers encountered the stones in large numbers, some arranged in lines or clusters. With no understanding of their significance, many were moved, blown apart by workers looking for gold inside, or simply rolled into new locations for convenience. By the time archaeologists arrived to study them systematically, the original spatial context of a significant portion of the spheres had already been destroyed. The spheres are attributed to the pre-Columbian peoples of the Diquís region, crafted between approximately 600 and 1500 CE. They are listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the 4 surviving sites where spheres remain in their original positions have been studied extensively. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The largest spheres achieve near-perfect roundness, with surface deviations from true spherical geometry that researchers have measured in millimeters across objects 2 meters in diameter. How they were made is one of the genuine open questions. The stone is extremely hard. No metal tools were available to the Diquís people. The prevailing view is that the spheres were roughed out through a combination of controlled fracturing, using fire and water to crack the stone along natural lines, and then ground and polished using abrasives over extended periods. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that this process is achievable, but achieving the level of geometric precision observed in the largest examples would have required sustained, highly skilled effort and, almost certainly, some method of measuring and checking sphericity during the process that we have not yet identified archaeologically. What the spheres meant and what they were for is less clear. They appear to have been associated with high-status burial sites and elite spaces, and were likely symbols of authority, cosmological significance, or ritual power. Some researchers have proposed astronomical alignments in their original groupings, though the displacement of so many spheres during the plantation clearing era makes this hypothesis very difficult to evaluate. The evidence for deliberate alignment that remains at undisturbed sites is suggestive but not conclusive. The deeper frustration is the one that runs throughout pre-Columbian archaeology in Central and South America. The societies that made these objects did not survive the Spanish conquest and the epidemics that accompanied it intact. The knowledge systems, cosmologies, and oral traditions that would have explained the sphere's meaning and manufacture were severed in the 16th century, often deliberately. What we are left with is the objects themselves, physically astonishing, contextually mute. A 2.5-meter sphere of near-perfect roundness, carved without metal tools from one of the hardest stones available, moved across jungle terrain to a precise location, and we still do not fully know why. Halfway through, and the shape of a larger question is becoming clear. At Chavín, the architecture itself was the technology, designed to alter perception, to reinforce authority, to transform a mountain interior into an instrument of ritual power. In the Diquís Delta, the technology was the object, geometric perfection achieved through materials and methods that still resist full reconstruction. In each case, what survives is extraordinary. What is missing is the explanation, the human voices, the instructional traditions, the deliberate choices that would close the gap between the object and our understanding of it. What were these societies capable of, and why does that question keep demanding more than a simple answer? The next 3 discoveries make it harder still to respond with certainty. In the highland city of Aksum in northern Ethiopia, rising from the soil of a field that has been continuously inhabited for at least 2,000 years, there are stone obelisks unlike any others in the ancient world. The stele of Aksum, erected by the Aksumite civilization at its height, roughly between the 1st and 7th centuries CE, are monolithic granite shafts carved to represent multi-story buildings. Their surfaces are worked in precise relief to show rows of windows, false doors, decorative beams, and architectural details arranged across a tapering shaft that in the largest surviving example rises over 20 meters from its base. They are not assembled from blocks. Each stela is a single piece of stone, quarried from outcrops several kilometers from the city, shaped, carved, transported and raised upright. The largest stela ever erected at Aksum, now fallen and broken, is estimated to have stood 33 meters tall and weighed approximately 500 tons. To put that in perspective, 500 tons is roughly the weight of a fully loaded Boeing 747 multiplied by 3. It was moved upright or near upright at some stage of the process, across several kilometers of highland terrain and then raised vertically without the use of any technology that archaeological evidence has so far confirmed. The Aksumite kingdom was a sophisticated state, literate, with its own script, monetized economy, and long-distance trade connections stretching to Rome, India, and Arabia. It was the civilization that adopted Christianity in the 4th century CE, decades before Rome. Its engineers were not working in a vacuum of technical knowledge. They had access to rope, timber, ramps, and human labor in substantial quantities, and they appear to have developed methods for the quarrying and transport of enormous stone blocks that were refined over generations. What is not fully understood is the raising mechanism for the largest stele. Experimental and computational studies have proposed various systems: earthen ramps, lever and counterweight arrangements, A-frame structures, and none has been definitively ruled out. The broken Great Stela, which toppled at some point in antiquity, may have failed during erection, which would itself be evidence of the attempt to raise something at or beyond the practical limits of the available technology. There is also the question of what the stele meant. The funerary function is reasonably well established. The stele marked the tombs of Aksumite elites, and excavations beneath them have revealed elaborate underground burial chambers. But the specific symbolism of carving a stone shaft to resemble a building, a false architecture towering above the real city, is something researchers continue to discuss. Was it a representation of a palace, meant to house the spirit of the deceased? A statement of dynastic power visible from a distance? A cosmic axis between Earth and the heavens above? One stela was looted by Mussolini's forces in 1937 and stood in Rome for decades before being returned to Ethiopia in 2008. Its reinstallation required modern cranes and significant international engineering assistance. The fact that the same stone was raised the first time, roughly 1,500 years ago, by people working without that machinery, is a detail that the engineering teams involved noted with something approaching disbelief. There is an island in the Western Mediterranean where, if you stand on almost any high point and look out across the landscape, you will see a stone tower. Then another. Sometimes several, depending on the elevation and the clarity of the air. Sardinia contains approximately 7,000 surviving nuraghe, dry stone towers built from large basalt blocks without mortar, rising between 10 and 20 meters in height, distributed across virtually the entire island. They were constructed by the Nuragic people between roughly 1800 and 700 BCE, a span of over 1,000 years. Some stand alone. Many are grouped into multi-tower complexes with connecting walls and surrounding villages, forming what appear to be significant centers of local power and social organization. The construction technique is corbelling. Each successive layer of stone is laid slightly inward from the one below until the layers converge at a cap. The interiors are chambers of tapering, self-supporting geometry that have remained structurally sound for over 3,000 years in a seismically active region. When you stand inside a nuraghe, the ceiling, several meters above, is held in place purely by the weight and arrangement of the stones surrounding you. Nothing has been added, nothing has been replaced. It is original Bronze Age masonry, and it works. What makes the Nuragic civilization genuinely puzzling to archaeologists is not the quality of the construction, but the social model that apparently produced it. Monumental building programs of this scale and consistency, 7,000 towers, maintained over a millennium, are typically the products of centralized state societies with administrative hierarchies, taxation systems, and coercive labor mobilization. Egypt built pyramids, Mesopotamia built ziggurats, Rome built roads. In each case, there was a state apparatus behind the construction. The Nuragic people appear to have had none of that. The archaeological evidence suggests a society of chiefdoms or clan-based communities, prosperous and trade-connected. Nuragic bronzetti figurines have been found across the Mediterranean, and Nuragic pottery appears in Cyprus and the Aegean, but without the palace economies or administrative bureaucracies typically associated with civilization-scale building. How a decentralized society sustained a construction tradition of this density and consistency for over 1,000 years is a question that Sardinian archaeology is still actively debating. The bronzetti themselves are worth pausing on. These small bronze figurines, depicting warriors with horned helmets, wrestlers, animals, ships, and ritual figures, are executed with a stylistic sophistication and variety that reflects a fully developed artistic tradition, not a nascent one. They are objects that belong to a culture with long aesthetic memory and high craft standards, and yet that culture, for reasons that remain unclear, left no writing, no administrative tablets, no palace archives. After Phoenician and Carthaginian contact in the early 1st millennium BCE, the Nuragic tradition transformed and eventually ceased. The towers were not demolished. Many remained in use for centuries, occupied and repurposed by successive populations. But the specific civilization that built them, the one that could look at a basalt landscape and see 7,000 towers waiting to be constructed, dissolved without leaving a clear explanation of itself. What it left behind is the towers, and the towers 3,000 years later are still standing. Of all the discoveries in this documentary, this one is perhaps the most quietly radical, because if the most contested interpretation of the evidence is correct, it would require a rewriting not just of a single chapter of ancient history, but of one of its most foundational assumptions. The Vinča culture was a Neolithic civilization that flourished in the Balkans, primarily in the territory of modern Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and adjacent regions, between approximately 5500 and 3500 BCE. It was a sophisticated agricultural society with large planned settlements, two-story houses, advanced pottery, early copper metallurgy, and evidence of long-distance trade. At its height, Vinča settlements were among the largest in Europe, with some sites estimated to have housed several thousand people. Distributed across Vinča artifacts, pottery, figurines, spindle whorls, and clay tablets, is a system of incised marks. Abstract signs, lines, crosses, chevrons, spirals, combs, and more complex composite symbols appearing repeatedly across a wide geographic area and an extended time span. More than 1,000 individual signs have been catalogued. Some appear in consistent groupings, some recur across different sites and different generations of artifacts. The debate about what these marks represent is one of the most genuinely contested in European prehistory. One position, associated most prominently with archaeologist Maria Gimbutas and later with researchers including Harold Harmon, argues that the Vinča marks constitute a true writing system, the earliest known script in the world, predating Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics by over 1,000 years. Under this interpretation, the Vinča culture possessed symbolic communication of a sophistication that changes the entire chronology of writing. The mainstream archaeological position is more cautious. The prevailing view among most specialists is that the Vinča marks are a system of symbols, meaningful, probably communicative in some capacity, possibly associated with ownership, ritual, or identity, but that they do not meet the defining criteria of a writing system, which requires the ability to encode spoken language. The marks do not appear in sequences of sufficient length or consistent enough internal structure to demonstrate linguistic encoding. They are symbolic, but the case that they are linguistic has not been conclusively made. This is a genuine scholarly disagreement, not a fringe controversy. The difficulty is partly evidential and partly definitional. What counts as writing and what counts as proto-writing is a boundary that researchers themselves draw in different places. What is not disputed is that the Vinca marks represent a sophisticated, shared symbolic system operating across a wide region and an extended time frame, something that required cultural continuity, shared meaning, and deliberate transmission across generations. The society that produced them was not simple. Vinca settlements show evidence of social differentiation, specialized craft production, and what appears to be a structured symbolic vocabulary used consistently enough to suggest institutional or ritual function. These were not isolated scratches, they were a system. Whether that system was writing or something adjacent to writing, a form of communication whose category we do not yet have the right word for, the Vinca marks remain one of the most thought-provoking bodies of evidence from prehistoric Europe, and they remain, after decades of study, incompletely understood. A civilization that may have been communicating in symbols for 2,000 years before the cultures we credit with inventing writing. If that is what the evidence shows, and the debate is not over, the implications are significant enough that the scholarly caution surrounding them is entirely warranted. 5 discoveries. An Andean oracle complex whose tunnels were engineered to disorient and transform. Perfect stone spheres carved without metal in a jungle whose keepers did not survive to explain them. Monolithic towers in East Africa raised to heights that challenged the machinery of the modern era. An island blanketed in 3,000-year-old stone towers built by a society that left no administrative record of itself. And a Neolithic civilization in the Balkans that may have been writing, or something very close to it, before writing was supposed to exist. Each of these discoveries arrived with a kind of epistemic jolt, a moment where the people studying them had to pause and ask whether the framework they were using was adequate to what the evidence was showing. In some cases, the framework held, and the discovery was absorbed, expanded, refined. In others, the debate is still running, the question still open, the final word not yet written. That is not a failure of archaeology. It is what archaeology actually looks like when it is done honestly. The discipline is not a process of confirming what we already believe. It is a process of asking what the physical record means and accepting that the physical record sometimes means something unexpected. What connects these 5 sites is not geography, not time period, not culture. What connects them is the same gap, the gap between the capability demonstrated in the evidence and the capability we assigned to the people who made it. That gap has appeared in Turkey and Bolivia, in Malta and Japan and Egypt, in Peru and Costa Rica and Ethiopia and Serbia. It keeps appearing at different coordinates, in different materials, in different forms. It is possible that this pattern is telling us something important. Not about lost civilizations or suppressed history, but about the ordinary, unremarkable truth that human intelligence is ancient, and that the conditions for sophistication are not as rare as the surviving record might suggest. Most of what people made and knew and understood has not survived. What we have is a fragment, and the fragment, on examination, keeps being more interesting than expected. The question that opened this documentary: what does it mean to call an ancient society primitive when the evidence keeps demonstrating otherwise, has no clean resolution. What it has is momentum. Every field season, somewhere in the world, an excavation produces something that wasn't predicted. Every new analysis of an old artifact finds a layer that wasn't seen before. Every underwater survey of an unexplored coastline maps formations that require explanation. The ancient world is not finished revealing itself, and the discoveries that will most change our understanding of it are almost certainly the ones we have not yet made.